Hello, and welcome to a little introduction to motorboats of the various sorts: MTBs, MGBs, S boats, E boats, PT boats, mass boats, masses of mass boats, in fact. Um, what do all these things mean? Um, yeah, so that's what this is here to help with. So, to start off with, I've got at least some of the descriptions. So the MTB, motor torpedo boat; MGB, motor gunboat; MASB, motor anti-submarine boat; ML, motor launch; SGB, steam gunboat. So that's the only one out of all of these. There were only 7 of them that had something other than a motor internal combustion engine. They were powered by a steam turbine. Worked well. They had a giant pressure cooker inside them, waiting to explode on being shot at by the Germans, rather than sitting on anything up to 3,000, 5,000 gallons of high octane petrol. Yeah, these people were insane. So the Americans used PT boats. They also had one other brief term, but not really in great deal. There's the Schnellboote, which just means fast boat. These were generally known as E-boats, but to the Allies. E just meaning enemy. Wow, so imaginative. And the Germans also had the Raumboote, R-boats, which I'll get on to. The Italians really liked the term mass, which stood for a wide variety of different things. Motoscafo armato silurante, motoscafo anti-sommergibile, uh, mezzi di assalto, motosiluranti, and vedetta anti-sommergibile. That last one being, quite lonely out on its own, not beginning with M. More seriously, the Italians really did beautifully on this. My Italian pronunciation is the opposite. And sauces, not of the ragu or bolognese sense, are listed at the end. The websites I used, actually, to be completely honest, Wikipedia is actually mostly accurate on these things, but I did go through and check, and so I've gone through to find these. So what did the British actually do? Well, they actually had a lot more, and this is just some of the earlier stuff. So before the war, you had about 6 different designs, ranging between 60 feet and 72 feet long, being developed by 3 different companies: British Powerboat Company, BPB. You'll see that quite a lot because I can't be bothered to write it all out. Vosper, Thornycroft, Fairmile, and then you also had some American boats, primarily in the early part of the war, built by Higgins and Elko, who went on to build huge numbers of PT boats for the Americans. And then there's a few slightly weird ones. There's the coastal motorboat, which was a Thornycroft design. Particularly the 55-foot one of those was actually just reused, taken back up, completely unchanged from what I can tell, or so they say, from the World War One design. And there was the harbour defence motor launch that just seems to have been built in ridiculously large numbers just about everywhere. The other thing that's worth saying about all of this is the RAF had actually got in on the act really quite early. They had been ordering from companies like the British Powerboat Company from about 1930 for things like seaplane tenders. and then high-speed launches for rescues and things, and their rescue services, and that's actually predates the Royal Navy getting involved and starting to procure these, which is slightly weird, but you dare go with it. So why did the British have so many different types? Why was it all so complicated? A few different reasons. They had multiple companies, some of which had some really what seemed to have been very strong personalities. British Powerboat Company, which was set up and kind of run by Hubert Scott Payne. Bosper was under a chap called Peter Duquesne. You had Thornycroft, J. Samuel White. They're also known as for their destroyers and things. And you had Fairmile Marine. The Royal Navy also weren't necessarily all that sure what they wanted. So in November 37, they were looking for 5 different types of boats, really, of these kind of motorboats. So 3 different types of MTB, a motor minesweeper, and an anti-submarine boat. So that doesn't help either, because each of those is going to be slightly different nuance to the design parameter. So the Royal Navy were caught at the wrong time. They were still very much in the development phase of building their different kind of boats, working out what worked, what didn't. And then suddenly war, and so they basically say, whatever you're set up to build, whatever you've got the jigs built, set up to build the hulls for, which is how you'd form the boats' hulls out of their, with the shaping, the wooden things. They basically went, yeah, build it now, whatever, just crack on. Very similar to the reason why the Bristol Beaufighter was able to be put into production quickly, because it used many of the same jigs for assembly as the Bristol Beaufort that had preceded it. The Royal Navy also took over some orders being built for other countries like Romania, and they also got the wrong war. The Royal Navy had been expecting pretty much a rerun of the First World War. So they'd been expecting the Germans to be fairly bottled up, not to make huge strides down the Channel coast from their little bit of North Sea access. And so the main threat in coastal waters was going to be the submarines, because the transits would probably be too far for the for kind of torpedo boats to make it across. Then suddenly in May and June 1940, you had France, Belgium, and the Netherlands falling very quickly to the Germans, and the Germans very rapidly moved their 2 S-Boot flotillas to places like Ostend, and started raiding the British coastal convoys by early July, which was unexpected, because the Royal Navy had set up motor torpedo boats and they had the motor anti-submarine boats, and suddenly there were no submarines, but there were these things driving around on the surface very quickly, doing shooty things and launching torpedoes. And so they took all the anti-submarine warfare gear off the motor anti-submarine boats and put more guns on, and lo, for they did create the motor gunboat. Yeah, that was basically how that came about. Although I haven't gone into that in too much detail. If you want to read more, I would suggest this. No, it's really not going to want to come into focus. The Royal Navy Motor Gunboat, 1942 to 45, Owner's Workshop Manual from Haynes. Good fun. So, yeah, what next? So the British, were they worse than others? Well, yes. I mean, the main peers to Britain, and I'm being incredibly unfair here and excluding quite a lot of countries that had some very serious motor torpedo boats and things. Germany, the USA, Italy, had all standardized a bit earlier, and or didn't have the same profusion of companies looking to build. The Royal Navy was trying to change, but would also wanted to make the changes incremental so that they could not disrupt production too much. Just on the topic of kind of production things, so the Germans mainly had their boats built by their S-Boote, built by Lürsen, with some by Schlichting, while the US had timed things perfectly, and in October 41, at a meeting between representatives of the Bureau of Ships and the CNO's office from the Navy side, and Elco, Higgins, and Huckins, the three of the big producers of their boats, managed to really standardize and decide what they wanted at that point. Obviously, by then, Britain had been fighting for 2 years, which made it a little harder. And there was, those sorts of problems for the British. I'll specify a bit more about the US stuff. Also, at almost at the same sort of time, the Americans set out their mechanism for organizing their torpedo boats, which made quite a lot of sense, where basically they commissioned the torpedo boat squadrons rather than the individual boats. So it was more like a aircraft, which just made life easier for them. That. So just to now talk about two of the companies and personalities in a bit more detail, because it gives a bit of a flavour of what had been going on. So British Powerboat Company had been set up by Hubert Scott Payne, who'd been an early part of the Supermarine or Pemberton Billings company that had really been trying to build kind of combining the kind of the fast boat building and early aircraft with with the kind of powerful engines thing. He then went on, set up British Powerboat Company in the 1920s, and by the start of the war, he'd actually moved himself across to the States. To North America. He was setting up the Canadian Powerboat Company that was registered in 1940 and built torpedo boats in Canada, unsurprisingly. I think mostly in Montreal, just outside Quebec on the St. Lawrence River. He also was working quite closely with Elco, and Elco took some of their designs, were basically British Powerboat Company designs, or near enough. He does seem to have been a real Marmite personality. People either loved him or hated him, and I think quite a lot of people hated him because apparently he missed out on any of the post-war honours, and so did pretty much anyone associated with his company. Eek. Then Fairmile Marine, set up by a chap called Noel Macklin, who'd been born in Western Australia but then came back over to the UK. He was into the tech of the time. So by 1909, he was racing a Mercedes at Brooklands. In World War One, he was initially in the Royal Artillery or Royal Field Artillery, Royal House Artillery, can't remember which, possibly both, until he was apparently invalided out in 1915, at which point he promptly joined the Royal Naval Reserve and saw service with the Dover Patrol. After World War One, he ended up setting up 4 different car companies, which included some ones with cool names and some which didn't. So they were Silverhawk, Invicta, Railton, and Eric Campbell. I think there's some winners in there, and there's some not so winners. Fairmile was named after where he they had a family estate in Cobham or Chobham, can't remember. They're very close to each other. They are different places though. And so it was that was Fairmile, and he used it as a kind of group name for quite a lot of his projects, from what I can tell. And shortly before World War II started, he was looking to develop a motor launch for the Navy because he could see the same gap that everyone else could. Then apparently because he couldn't get the kind of backing money, can't think what it was about having had at least four car companies through the 1920s and 30s that meant that people were a bit kind of, really? You want us to invest money in you? Really? Really? Hmm. It actually ended up being kind of taken over and run by the government. So I think the employees counted as civil servants or something, but worked well, and I'll come on to a bit more about them in a second. So the Fairmile motor launches, they're separate from the motor gunboats, motor torpedo boats, motor anti-submarine boats. They were a chunk slower. You had 3 hull designs and 4 types. So the A's were the first ones. They were, I think, Macklin's own design. They had some really good concepts, but they didn't work out quite as well as might be hoped. So the Royal Navy sent somebody from their side to go and from the Directorate of Naval Construction to go and help design or put in a design. They came up with something that you can tell was fairly successful because they built over 500 of them. That was the Fairmile B. That got used all over the place for just about everything. They were being used not only as kind of anti-submarine warfare boats, but also they got fitted with torpedo tubes taken off American Lend-Lease destroyers, those Town class, the 4-stackers. They got used as gunboats. They were used as minesweepers in Malta, when even the kind of fishing boat based things were minesweepers were getting blown up on the mines because they just had such a shallow draft. And they got used in kind of other weird roles, like taking part in the San Nazaire raid, where I think most of them did not survive the intensive German defensive fire. And I think somebody got a VC, sadly posthumously. Then, whilst they were kind of developing a better version, that would be the kind of the D boat, the dog boat, that's kind of was the best British boat probably. They still had the jigs for the A hull, and so they built 24 of those and equipped them as gunboats as a kind of interim measure. Then the dog boats came along, and they were big enough that they could operate as both kind of a motor torpedo boat and a motor gunboat. So have enough gun armament to really drive off attacking E-boats and still be carrying torpedoes to sink the kind of coastal convoy ships and things like that. There's something which I will confess I don't know enough to really explain, which is that the B and the D, so the ones which weren't designed by, where the hull wasn't designed kind of by the private person but was from somebody from DNC, were described as having destroyer-like forward hulls. Although then kind of the powerboat sterns, I'll be honest, I don't really know what that means versus a speedboat forward hull, but I think it may have meant that they could take a heavier sea a bit better, but I really don't know. Yeah, the Italians, masses of masses. The brief bit of background. I mean, the Italians were about the first or second group of people to take the combination of small boat, engine, torpedo, and go mix around. And whilst the British had ended World War One with the pretty solidly successful Thornycroft designed 55-foot coastal motorboat, CMB, which then just got completely restarted production for World War II. It was that good. The Italians had really gone all in. And so by the end of hostilities, they had delivered 244, apparently, motoscafo anti-sommergibili mass boats. Then, after the end of the First World War, 1920s, not so good in some ways, all very peaceful, which for Yeah. And so not much money in military development. Then around 1931 too, they started ordering a prototype or two, which is roughly similar to when the Royal Navy was doing things. They started ordering series production around 1936, again roughly on par probably with the British. And interestingly, as with the British, the Italians seem to have found that the boats that they had ordered early weren't big enough, and not only were they not necessarily able to deal with all of the demands, but they actually just didn't handle the sea all that well, and so rough weather was a bigger issue. And so the Italians did move on with what they were doing. Then the other one one of the others I wanted to cover quickly was the US Navy's PT boats. One of the comments on this, which was from an American source, so I'm not, was that the interwar US experience of motorboats, fast motorboats, had really been from the private sector, running during the Prohibition. No absolutely direct links, but some of the small boat people had gained experience from there. Then, similarly to the Royal Navy, about a year earlier, I think it was a year earlier, in July of 38, the US Navy invited designs for 4 different types of motorboats, for kind of torpedo boats, anti-submarine boats, things like that. Then that produced, well, just for two of those types, it produced 4 designs, 2 of which were ordered of each type from different yards and slightly complicated, but and then, having just done all of that, British Powerboat Company had got quite a good relationship with Elco having built hundreds of motor launches for the Royal Navy during World War One. There was kind of an established good relationship, and British Powerboat Company, what's his chops, Hubert Scott Payne had moved across to North America at this stage, so he kind of was helping, and apparently the British Powerboat Company boat that was bought by the US Navy, but by Elco on their behalf, and then taken off them. But apparently it was legit. Arrived in New York Harbor on the 5th of September 39. That was a roughly 70-foot boat, I think. But then things got bigger and bigger, and one of the drivers for the Americans was they wanted where the British earlier boats had been using 18-inch torpedoes. That wasn't really something the Americans were using, apparently. I'm guessing for kind of motorboat type things, because they used them on their aeroplanes. But this was the thing. They wanted to stick 21-inch torpedoes on them. So they needed to scale things up, and ultimately they ended up with the kind of going into kind of the mass production with a 78-foot Higgins design and an 80-foot Elco, and made hundreds of them. Then you get the Schnellboote, the Germans, and this is what were called E-boats mostly. They had got their first one in about 1930. At the start of World War II, they had 2 flotillas, and they still only had 2 flotillas when France and Germany, when France and the Low Countries fell, and the E-boats Schnellboote were able to move to places like, as I say, it was Ostend and somewhere else. I want to say Dunkirk, but I may well be wrong on that one. But they kind of went through a few generational changes, and ended up with their 18th example was really set the tone for pretty much the rest of their wartime production, to be perfectly honest, until 44. So that was S-18 that was delivered in 1938. It was 35 meters long, give or take, was about just under 115 feet, displaced somewhere around 100 tons, and they were all capable of 38.5 to 39 knots. They would carry two 533 millimeter, 53.3 centimeter torpedoes, which is roughly a 21 inch, and they'd have a variety of cannon, which generally they increased the armament according to what was available over and increased over time as the motor gunboats and things, you know, to that were fighting them off increased in their combat power as well. So they could end up with up to 7 20mm cannons. So I think it was so one quad, or was it 9? A quad 20mm cannon mounting, 2 twins, and a single. So that's 9. Well done, me with maths. Or they could end up with a 37mm or a 40mm in place of that kind of quad 20mm. And they also started fitting them with armor and things like that, because their role wasn't to fight the British MTBs and MGBs. Their role was to try and interdict the convoys. It was the British who were kind of having both an attacking and defending thing. And the Germans were also notable for using diesel. I think the Italians may have done as well. The British almost exclusively seem to have used petrol, gasoline, often 100 octane. Very explodey. Yeah. Madness. Anyway, the other German thing was the Schnellboote, our boats. These seem to have been basically the same as the Royal Navy's motor launches. So they were about the same sort of size as an E-boat, but about half the speed. Designed initially for an anti-submarine role, but pressed into all kinds of service and things. So that's those. So now moving on to sauces, and I don't mean ragu or bolognese, even for the Regia Marina ones, I promise. I felt I needed to put that joke in. So as with a lot of things, start with having a quick look at Wikipedia, trust nothing on there, look at the sources. Again, not ragu, or even pesto. So things I found, this was stuff that everything bar one of these things is free for access. So there's a Kindle version of John Lambert's Shipcraft special on Allied torpedo boats, that the kind of free preview first chapter or so covers quite a bit about the development of those. I've got the Haynes manual on the Royal Navy motor gunboat that is good fun and has a lot of quite a lot of detail about the British Powerboat Company, which I'm not entirely sure how I feel about, but you know, in terms of as a company and things. The RAF stuff is actually really quite an interesting parallel, and also randomly manages to bring in Lawrence of Arabia. I mean, really, it's how? I don't know, but he ended up testing some of these motor launches. And at the RAF Museum in Hendon, as part of their collection, they've got a seaplane tender, ST-206. So there's discussion about that, and they've also got a couple of post-war high-speed motor launches, HSMLs or HSLs, that are also part of the collection. So they've got stuff about those. Then an array of websites, so kind of 2 lines, 7 or about UK stuff, but also they're quite useful as a source. And you know, I started this wanting to talk more about the British side. So coastalforces.org.uk, cfv.org.uk, which is Coastal Forces Veterans. Unit Histories has some good detailed breakdown. HMS Medusa is a charity, so quite a few of these. BMPT is British Motor. I can't remember. British Motor Power Trust or something. I can't remember. Again, another charitable organisation. PNB is Portsmouth Naval Base Property Trust, which is where some of the boats are based, which is associated with the Historic Dockyard Museum as well, and things, I think, in the Museum of the Royal Navy. And there is the coastalforces.org.uk. There's now a museum of that, again, down in Portsmouth, and there's stuff like that. The brilliant Ibilio, I'm never sure how to say that, Hyperwar super site has a whole book about US PT boats called Close Quarters, which was fab and is where I got the stuff about the rum runners and things. Then you've got sboot.net and germannavy.de, which feel like wonderful mishmashes, but they had good English language details and data. And then www.regiamarina.net seemed perfectly good, and again was doing some cross-checking, making sure that things actually circles were closing and things seemed to be agreeing with each other. Yeah. So that was supposed to be quick and easy, and that's been just over half an hour. So, yay. Sorry, thumbs trying to go up. I'm doing the fuzzy background thing. I'm not used to doing it. Yeah. Sorry. Bye.